Welcome to the Art of Wargaming on the General Nerdery Network. I am your host, Malark. Today's episode concerns Clausewitz's idea on invasion. But before we begin, I wanted to give a shout out to those who support our work. Your contribution makes a huge difference. If you like what we do, give us a like, share, or review depending on what platform you use. Consider sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. We try to bring you fresh and exciting perspectives from events and fighters around the world. So if you'd like to aid in our endeavors, head on over to Patreon and join our elite force of supporters. And before we get into this episode, I just wanted to talk about a little bit of the gaming that I've been doing recently. I'm still trying to get back into the regular war gaming thing, like the tabletop stuff. The only issue I've been having is that most of my friends are going through a dry spell as well. One of them in particular, he's helping me paint my models, and he doesn't particularly want to start doing this particular game until he gets his models also painted. So by the time that we actually hit the tabletop, we're both going to be looking fly, we're both going to be having great kits, or as the kids are saying these days, fits. So I'm looking forward to that. I might even share some videos with you or some photos with you. We'll see how it goes. But my primary gaming experience recently is one that really speaks to what we're talking about here. Because sometimes, especially those of us who play any sort of video games, it can be hard to understand the unique challenges and obstacles that were faced during this time frame when Clausewitz was writing. But I found this awesome game that I think you'll enjoy as well. And I really should start getting endorsements from people, but I just get so excited about some of these games, and I want to share them with you. This one is called Holdfast. All one word, Holdfast. And it is amazing in terms of the detail that they pay to the uniforms, to the music, because musicians were a huge part of warfare during this time. And they've got like the legitimate fife and drum songs that these sides would have used during the Napoleonic Wars. As a historian, I am just tickled by the level of detail that they've gone into here. And the gameplay itself is amazing. It'll give you an impression about what it was like to have to deal with a musket that took forever to load, what it was like to have to go against fortresses and against your opponent who is also forming these lines and firing at you. And, of course, the predominance of artillery. Do not forget that artillery was a huge part of what Clausewitz was advocating for in his work, and it is something that is of absolute importance when we're dealing with something like Holdfast. If you have the mic off, it very much feels like a realistic experience for the most part. Like you can still hear the officers' orders because they're all in-game buttons, so you know when to line up, when to fire, when to be ready. So if you've got a good officer or a good sergeant, they're going to keep you on point as to what you should be doing in a given area, because a lot of the classes, if you are standing in a line, if you have a flag nearby, if you have music nearby, if you have an officer of some sort nearby, it helps your stats. It'll either help you be more accurate, it'll help you not die as quickly. So there is something to be said for encouraging you to fight in the historical way that they would have at the time. Now, caveat, if you are to turn the mic on, you'll find out that one of the cool features of this game is that it has proximity mics, which is to say that you can't necessarily hear teammates who are on the other side of the battlefield, but teammates who are close to you, you can absolutely hear what they're saying to one another. And there are absolutely people who get on there and they really get into their characters, and they really try to actually play to the time period. But if you've ever watched any YouTube videos of this particular game, you will know that some of these people are very, very, very silly. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If you enjoy engaging with a player base who are just in it for the laughs and who are out there saying some of the most random stuff, absolutely give the mic a try. It can be a very hilarious time, even when somebody is blaring music over their headphones that has nothing to do with the time period that we're talking about. For instance, one of the times I was assaulting a fortress, somebody was playing I'm a Gummy Bear. And while you wouldn't necessarily associate that with the Napoleonic Wars, man, it was a banger and it got us motivated. So check it out. It's a really fun game. The last I checked, it was on sale on Steam. But even if not, it is well worth paying for, because this game, in particular with the material that we're studying right now, will give a really good idea of what battle would have looked like, what the actual warfare itself would have looked like, without all of the, dysentery and cholera and other wonderful things that went along with living during this time. So check out Holdfast. It's a lot of fun. Maybe I'll see you on there. But yeah, that's been my primary gaming experience. I've still been keeping up with what's been going on with Warhammer, and definitely what's going on with Belegarth. I currently cannot fight. I had a surgery a few months ago, and I'm still waiting to heal up from it, but I'm still going and attending practices and encouraging people in the Great Hunt, which I think I may have talked about on this show before, but that is an organization within Belegarth that encourages growth. It has very clear goals, very clear objectives that you can get to and achieve, and so you can very much measure your progression as a fighter. And to add to that, it's also got some fun lore, and we definitely get into it. So honestly, if that's something that interests you, I have another podcast called Enter the Miasma, which is on the lore for this given thing. We have fun with it. It's definitely in character, so if you're into that sort of thing, please check that one out. But otherwise, I'm excited to get into the new year with y'all. I'm excited to get into this material. So let's jump straight into it with Clausewitz's ideas on invasion. For those of you reading along at home, you'll notice that this particular section is full of Clausewitzianisms, which is to say that he has lists within his lists within his lists. So going through this particular chapter, I tried to combine things the best I could in a logical way so that while talking about it, I don't confuse myself, because for as brilliant as Clausewitz was as a military thinker, he also probably needed some lessons in grammar and word placement. But we're going to soldier on the best we can, like some British grenadiers. As we know from elsewhere in Clausewitz's writings, we know that for him, the culminating point of victory doesn't necessarily result in the destruction of the enemy's army. We can often do this without having to destroy our enemy at all, by seizing choice areas, or areas that are politically advantageous, or some such things. It doesn't mean that we don't have to destroy the opponent's army, but just that it isn't necessarily the definition of the victory that we're looking for here. The victory that we're looking for when it comes to invasion comes from the sum of physical and mental powers combined. So physical powers, we already pretty much can guess what those are. We're talking logistics. We're talking troops. We're talking material. Stuff like that. And then mental powers, as we have discussed previously, are almost just as important. Making sure that morale is kept up, making sure that our people are well-fed, well-motivated, and absolutely into our efforts. This is huge too. You can have the best equipped army in the world, but if you don't have a fighting spirit, it doesn't count for much. So there are things that are going to increase our strength as an advancing army, and things that will decrease our strength. And when we get into a little bit more of that, we're also going to talk about how some of those strength increases can flip on us and end up being decreases, and how some decreases can flip and become an advantage, a strength. But let's start with the causes of strength and what they do to increase our advancing army. The first one, even though we were just talking about the destruction of the enemy's army not being necessary for victory, nevertheless, if the enemy army is suffering losses, that is a strength for us, because we're talking about proportions, right? So even if our numbers remain the same, let's say that I've got 100 troops and you've got 100 troops, but then you've dropped to 80 troops, that's a 20% decrease. So even though I have not lost a single person, I am now fighting from an advantage because I've got those numbers. And so anytime our enemy is losing personnel, that is important, and that is a cause of strength for us. And that can be from anything. Of course, battle is one of the chief ways to do this, but we've also got disease, starvation, exposure to the elements. So there are any number of reasons that our enemy might be having losses from their army, but all of these reasons are worth capitalizing on. The second one is if the enemy is losing inert means. So when we're talking about inert means, we're talking about just the physical aspects where we draw our strength from. So this is stuff like bridges, magazines, fortresses, anything that is stationary and is vital to the war effort. Obviously, if the enemy is losing that and we are gaining it, that is a strength increase for our advancing army. A loss of territory will also give us strength as we are going forwards. It gives us more room to maneuver. It gives us more room to think about what we're going to do next, where we're going to hit next. And it gives us a buffer a lot of the times between us and where our enemy is going to be. So as our enemy is losing territory, they're also losing, and this brings us to the fourth point, resources. Whether this is access to mines or trade routes or food-producing regions, all of this is going to increase our own strength while decreasing the enemy's. Because, as you can probably tell by this pattern, what proportionately increases one decreases the other. Very much so with resources. The fifth cause of strength increase for our advancing army is a loss of internal organization or regular action within the opponent's army. Internal organization is vital to the running of the military effort. Officers need to know what they're supposed to do in order to get their troops where they need to be. There needs to be a clear chain of command up from the top down to the bottom so that people know who they're supposed to be listening to and who they're supposed to be talking to. If this internal organization begins to break apart for whatever reason, whether their army begins to get split into sections that are no longer able to communicate with one another, if they have started to lose officers at such a rate that they're having a hard time filling those gaps, this will lead to a loss of internal organization, which we can use for our benefit. And of course, regular action is in terms of what can they physically do? Do they have the supply trains and the wagons to move stuff from place to place, or are they just hoofing it on foot? This is a very important thing to consider, not just for the enemy, but also for ourselves, because regular action is what prepares us for battle and allows us to be able to rebuff the enemy's advances and for them to rebuff our own. The sixth cause of a strength increase for our army is if their allies secede from them and decide that they don't want to play no more. Even better is if they decide to become our allies. And there can be any number of reasons for this. They may see the writing on the wall and decide, oh, I want to be on the winning side so that in the aftermath, in the peace, I'm getting favorable treatment in some way. It could be from fear, saying, oh, if I don't detach myself from this particular nation, I might become a target next. Whatever the reason might be, as long as our enemy is losing allies, that is our benefit. Even if those allies don't come over to our side, even if they just choose to pull out of the war and remain neutral, that is huge. So to use an example from real world, the Ukraine war is still ongoing at this time, and losses are mounting on all sides. But Ukraine itself could not have held out as long as it has without allies, without help from the European Union, without help at one time from the United States. All of these efforts pushing in there, whether it be training, whether it be material in the forms of like, oh my goodness, long-range missiles or the drones that are being used, all of this stuff really matters for the Ukrainian war effort. If those allies were to secede from them, if the EU were to pull out for whatever reason, then they would find themselves at a huge disadvantage compared to the Russians. So those allies are vital to that particular war effort, and they are often vital throughout the course of entire history. So, to reiterate that point, if their allies are seceding from them for whatever reason, and especially if they become ours, that is increasing the strength of our army. And lastly, Before I talked about mental powers combined, right? Well, the discouragement of the enemy is huge. They can have all the training in the world. They can have all the gear in the world. But if they do not have a fighting spirit, if our advancement or the repeated losses of their side have made them demoralized, this is huge for us. All throughout history, we see examples of a military who may not have the best stuff, may not have the most training material, whatever along those lines, still overcome armies that they shouldn't win against simply because of morale. And this is extremely important in something like what we're dealing with in this style of warfare, because the urge to break from the line and run away when there are cannonballs screaming at you is very, very real. Trust me, if you decide to play Holdfast, you will know all about that. And the fact that, oh my goodness, cannons, get your head down. So if we can get our enemies to not want to line up, not want to deal with our firepower, not want to deal with our aggression, that discouragement becomes an advantage for us. Now, what causes a strength decrease for our advancing army? Well, we've got 5 things. The first one is being compelled into a siege. Now, a siege doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be losing a ton of people. Remember that during a siege, the attacking army absolutely has the advantage because in a lot of ways, they just kind of need to wait out their enemy. They've got fresh supplies. They've got the logistics to support their actions, whereas the people who are garrisoned inside whatever is being sieged, they only have limited supplies. They have limited resources. And when people are packed together like that for long periods of time without proper sanitation, disease runs rampant. So absolutely, the defenders are at a disadvantage there. However, this section is called invasion. And so if we're getting slowed down, if we're getting bogged down by having to dedicate resources to a siege, that's going to decrease our overall strength. In a similar vein, when we're going forward, we are obviously going to have to protect what we have gained. We talked about a loss of territory being a strength increase for us. But at the same time, we're going to need to leave occupation forces behind in order to prevent the enemy from just scooting around behind us and cutting us off from our own line of retreat or line of communications. So making sure that we have garrisons within that zone is extremely important. However, it is also going to bleed forces away from our actual army. So this is something important to consider, that the more we gain, honestly, the more we lose at the same time. The third one, of course, is the fact that in the same idea, we are extending our lines of communication. We are extending our lines of resupply, of retreat, as we get further away from the resources that we have in our homeland. Obviously, foraging is an option, and we may be taking over areas that have mines or fields or other things that can produce material for us, but that takes time. That takes organization, that takes the investment and future planning, which we may not have time to do. So most of what we have in terms of material, reinforcements, ammunition, is going to come from wherever we were coming from. So the further we advance into our opponent's territory, particularly if we're dealing with types of terrain that break things up or make travel difficult, so we're talking like marshes, forests, mountains, these are all going to exponentially make this particular strength decrease even more of a consideration. So it's not a good idea to just go barging into our opponent's territory. Obviously, if we're playing something like Warhammer 40K, we don't have to worry about lines of communication. However, we're talking about what Clausewitz was talking about, and that means that these factors are extremely important and something to make sure that we are considering when we are advancing. The fourth point is the opposite of what we were talking about in point 6 of the last little section, which was the idea of allies. And we will suffer a strength decrease if our opponent acquires allies over the course of the campaign. And this could be for any number of reasons. It could be because people are looking at a smaller force against a larger force and feel the need to intervene. It could be an old enemy of ours who's coming out of the woodwork in order to say, hey, this is a good opportunity to slow this person down or to bog down their resources so they can't come after me later. Or intermarriages or whatever reason might be occurring, the acquisition of allies by our enemy is an automatic strength decrease for us because, again, we're talking proportions. Even if I've got the same number of people, and that has not changed, if there are now allies on the opposing side, that throws those scales off balance again. So using some form of diplomacy, using some form of buffer to make sure this does not happen is important because allies, as we were talking about with the Ukraine war, can make all the difference in victory. And the fifth and last point in these causes for strength decrease are the great efforts of our adversary or the relaxation of effort by our own state. Morale is important. The enemy's morale is important. Our morale is important. And so if our opponent has been heroic in the battlefield, if they've been taking more losses, but have been really punching above their weight and sowing terror and bad morale into our forces, obviously this is going to be a huge strength decrease. But one of the things we often don't think about in terms of this sort of warfare is the fact that the commander is not in charge of absolutely everything. We have somebody who is in charge of the state from which the commander is coming. So this could be a prince, a king, a president, a prime minister, whatever that particular state has. If we are doing too well, if there is a need to say, oh, they got this, there might be a relaxation of effort by our own state, which is not good. We can see this within the American Civil War. Toward the beginning, when the state was fairly confident that it was going to be able to overcome the Confederacy with no real issue. I mean, they didn't have the production capability that the North had. They didn't have the same manufacturing capability. They didn't have the people coming through Ellis Island that the North did. And so there was kind of a relaxation of effort at that time, and it did not go well for the Union Army. Now, obviously, by the end of the war, that relaxation was gone, and Lincoln had said, hey, Grant, go have fun. And Grant said, hey, Sherman, let's go party. And the rest is history. But it cannot be overstated how important maintaining that battle spirit is, not just in our own army, but also in the state overall. So now, let's go back and take a look at some of the issues we have with those advantages that we just spoke of. When we were talking about the causes of strength increase for our army, what issues might those advantages actually incur to us? The first one being that enemy losses are most keenly felt directly after a defeat. This is why capitalizing on our victories and making sure to keep our opponent on the back foot is important, because the enemy can recover the longer they have to recover. So this also relates to the relaxation of our efforts or the relaxation of the state. We need to make sure that we're pressing that advantage, because the advantages that we incur from enemy losses are going to have diminishing returns as time moves on. So this is important when we're talking about the advantage here. Enemy army losses are not a static benefit. They are something that needs to be reinforced and capitalized on by our own forces. The second one being that the loss of inert means can be compensated for. We can't necessarily depend on the fact that because we've taken a bridge or a fort or a magazine, that now the enemy is permanently crippled. These means can be compensated for in any number of ways. They might acquire better trade deals with someone. They might be able to tap into some sort of resource that they weren't previously tapping into, but now are mobilizing for this. So to trust too much on the acquisition of inert means or the destruction of inert means to prevent our opponent from using them doesn't necessarily mean that that is going to be a guaranteed strength increase forever going forward. Summarizing these 2 points, enemy army losses are not permanent, and they can recover the longer they have to recover, and the loss of inert means can be compensated for. The third point here is something that I already touched upon when we were talking about those strength increases, and that's that captured territory only matters when we have pushed past it. just owning captured territory means that it is still vulnerable to counterattack. It is still vulnerable to sabotage, and it really only counts once we have pushed past it and left our garrisons and left our methods of control. Otherwise, it's just territory that we're standing on. Our opponent may not have it, but it doesn't mean that it's permanently ours until we have pushed forward. But when we are pushing forward, that idea of the occupation forces that we need to leave behind and the extended lines of communication absolutely play a part in kind of taking away the strength of capturing territory. So, making sure that we push forward, making sure that we are balancing our need for garrisons with our needs for keeping our army buff as we need it to be, and to make sure that we are not losing our internal organization by doing so as well. Remember, at the time that Clausewitz was writing, they didn't have radio. They didn't have the ability to drive a jeep from one place to another. They relied on horseback. They relied on a lot of different means of communicating, but those means of communication were also prone to being disadvantageous if something occurred to disrupt those particular methods of communication. So this is all stuff to consider when we are thinking about our advantages, because those advantages are only advantages if we are compensating for these issues right here. So let's not now talk about how our weaknesses can change depending on what we're looking at in terms of the evolving situation within war. The first one, already kind of touched on. Sieges take time, and holding captured assets uses troops. Now, we might not have a choice. If there's a large fortress that we're moving past in our efforts of taking territory, well, that means that there's a place that the enemy can sally forth from and disrupt what we are doing. So that thing kind of needs to be captured. Therefore, that siege is going to bleed away some of our strength. And of course, after we've captured said fortress or captured said town, that is going to take troops in order to hold that captured asset. It doesn't do us much good if we capture a fort, engage in that long and costly siege, move away, and then our opponent comes around behind us and reoccupies that fort. Not going to actually be an advantage at that point. So holding those captured assets is important, and we'll be using troops. In this same idea, like I was touching on before, captured territory must be garrisoned. Got to leave people behind, not only to keep our opponent from circling back around and trying to take that territory again, but also to make sure that the local population does not disrupt. There's no guarantee that when we're moving into a particular part of the country that we're going to be well received by the locals. In fact, if we're taking this territory from a sovereign nation, there is a good chance that they are not going to be happy about that and are going to do everything they can to sabotage our efforts. So making sure that this captured territory is garrisoned helps us prevent against the enemy coming back and recapturing that territory, and from a popular uprising, completely diminishing the fact that we have the territory in the first place. So the weakness change there is the fact that we got to leave troops to do that as well. Now, the other part that we hadn't talked about yet concerning this is as we expand forward into enemy territory, as we continue to push deeper into their holdings, that is also going to mean that our flanks are going to be getting larger. We're going to be extending our lines and opening up flank space. Increased flank space means that we also require protection there. It doesn't do us much good to advance deeply into enemy territory, have no protection on our flanks, and then get wrapped. That does not do well, and in fact puts us at a massive disadvantage. So both of these things, both the sieges that we were talking about and the captured territory needing to be garrisoned, including increasing the amount of protection that we have on our flanks, is super important. And all of that is going to decrease from our army's overall strength. When we increase our line of communications, it means that it's harder to get vital resources that we might need. Let's say that gunpowder gets wet. If we're close to our own lines, no biggie. We can just send out, get some more gunpowder, keep going. However, if we are deep in enemy territory and our gunpowder gets wet, or our food gets destroyed by pests or by weather, it's going to take longer for those resources to reach us. And that is not a good thing. So even if we've got a perfect logistical line, dealing with the world in which Clausewitz was, having that long line of communication means that it is going to be much harder to get those resources and is something that needs to be accounted for. The other issue with extending our line of communication, again, talking about in Clausewitz's time when we're using carrier pigeons to get from one place to another, is that issuing orders then takes more time. If our generals are sitting in the back, monitoring the front from where they are, as people get further away, suddenly it's going to take more and more time for the orders to get to them. That makes it more and more difficult to coordinate. One person might get the message at this time. Another person might get it a couple of days later. But both of those messages involved having a coordinated effort against one target. Well, you've got one section that is moving far faster than the other simply because of the amount of time that it took for those communications to reach them, especially if the state is involved. I want to use the American Civil War as an example again. Up until Grant was chosen as the commander of the Union forces, the Department of Defense, especially Abraham Lincoln, were very much directly involved in the war effort. And so that meant if stuff was happening right next to Washington, sure, the information got there pretty quick. But if they were going down into Virginia, or if they were going even further into the Carolinas, suddenly those orders coming from the department or coming from the office of the president took a lot longer to get there. Therefore, that coordination definitely wasn't there. And when you were dealing with somebody like Robert E. Lee, who was basically detached, like Jefferson Davis definitely was still in charge, but he was like, Robert E. Lee, you go do what you need to do and we'll support you as you need to do. That's part of the reason that Robert E. Lee's force, even though at a massive disadvantage for several reasons, was still able to whip the pants off of the Union for a good portion of the war, because he was able to operate from a place of those direct orders being right there. He was there with his commanders and was able to control the battlefield where he was. And so state involvement is not great. Another good example of this would be on the Eastern Front of World War II, where you had the Nazi forces that were marching further and further and further into Russia. At the time, Hitler believed himself to be a military genius, and he wanted to be directly involved in what was going on in those areas. And so as he was pushing around figures on a board, the generals, like Guderian, were living it on the front lines. But Guderian was not given the freedom of movement that somebody like Robert E. Lee was. He was still tied to the opinions and to the declarations of Adolf Hitler. So it's part of the reason that the war effort stalled out. It's part of the reason that the war effort was so dispersed on that side. And it's a big part of the reason as to why the Germans lost the Eastern Front. So having politicians involved in the actual making of war is not great, especially if you're dealing with a time period where those orders take a long time to get to the front lines. Another thing that might increase our weakness factor would be that our allies might change sides. They can go both sides. As we were talking about before, they might support the invader, that'd be us, in order to be on our good side afterwards. They might support the opposing side to weaken our efforts so that we're not able to give as much of a military effort in later campaigns. Let's go back to the Ukraine war real quick. Part of what has been making this such a bad time for Russia is because you have so many forces rushing to oppose them, and this is weakening their efforts. So if Putin had any aims at going after Lithuania, Poland, Greenland, that would make those efforts all the more difficult because of the amount of material and troops and morale in of itself that has been bled out in the fields of Ukraine. So to look at it from a strategic point of view, supporting Ukraine is good from a moral standpoint, supporting a state that is being aggressed by a larger state unjustly. It is good in the effort of weakening Russia in case their war plans have them going after other people as well. For instance, from what I can tell right now, Russia is in no position to be making war on any other country at the moment because they have had so much of their stuff bled out in Ukraine. So in this way, the Allies rushing to Ukraine have opposed that side, the invading side, in order to weaken future efforts. And that is part of the reason why I myself have been in huge support of any efforts that we can put into Ukraine, because it is something that defers later conflict in a very positive way and helps out somebody who very much wants to be a potential ally. And the last one of these changes that we can see in terms of something flipping and becoming a weakness to us rather than a strength is that sometimes pressure causes demoralization, as we said. Forces marching into the country might make people panic, might say, oh my goodness, they're here, they're right on our doorstep. It can cause desertions, it can cause just a breakdown of internal order of the army, and this would absolutely be an advantage to us. But this can also galvanize a population. If we're dealing with a particularly warlike people, having the enemy at the gate might make them quite angry and might make the troops fight all the harder because their families, their homes are being threatened. And so this is kind of something to be gauged based on who is being invaded. This is another thing we can see in the Ukraine war. As Russia has pushed further and further into Ukraine, they have galvanized and encouraged the people of Ukraine to fight back even harder. So this is something to make sure that we're paying attention to as we're advancing into enemy terrain. Is absolutely, it can be a good thing for us to have the demoralization on our side, but we have to make sure that we're watching out for a galvanized force that is then going to make up for the supposed weaknesses that we see in them. And all of this is to say, if it hasn't been established already in the general, let's establish it in the specific. Conquest is not enough without proper follow-up actions. If we are not protecting our flanks, if we are not making sure that our allies are happy or that our opponent's allies are angry and wanting to join us, if we are not making sure that we protect our lines of communication, make sure that we're garrisoning things, make sure that we're getting the proper supplies to our army and spread throughout the army, our conquest isn't going to mean anything. And we can even see this in games like 40K. If we push too far forwards to such a point that the backing units no longer can provide any sort of support, well, us pushing forward to that objective is not going to count for much if we can't keep it. Conquest doesn't count for anything if we can't keep it. So there's a lot of risks. As we can see through looking at these things, there's a lot of stuff that we can gain through invasion, but there's a whole lot that we also might lose. It's a risky, risky thing. So why continue to advance if there's such a risk? Why do an invasion in the first place if it puts us in a position that could be vulnerable? Well, we have to remember that the conquest itself is the means, not the end. The destruction of the enemy's forces, the taking of enemy territory is the means and not the end. What is the end? Well, it's the subjugation of the enemy state, which is to say, peace. Whether this means that we're going to, just be going after a little bit of territory, which is what Frederick did in a lot of his battles, was he wasn't looking to crush entirely and take the entirety of Silesia, but was looking to gain territory from that country as they moved through. Same thing with his other neighbors. He wasn't looking to subsume them into Prussia for the most part. He was looking for territory. So that was the subjugation of the enemy state, was to get them to capitulate to what his terms of peace were. And most of the time, we're not trying to get the entire enemy state to capitulate, but to meet whatever terms we have, whether that be territory or material or promises. These are what we're looking for in terms of subjugation. The Mongols, to use a less modern example, perfect example of this. They weren't looking to wholesale slaughter most other nations. Now, it did happen from time to time that was their method of pursuing, air quotes, peace. But for the most part, they'd roll in, crush the better part of an army, and then say, hey, if you give us what we want, we won't kill all of you. That worked out great. The subjugation was complete, even though they weren't all killed. Same thing as Rome. Rome would move into an area, and as long as that area was not militarily capable of resisting, all they wanted were provinces, people to contribute soldiers, people to contribute resources to the overall war efforts and to the overall empire. None of these things required the complete destruction of those states. Palestine is a good example. The Jewish people who were living in Palestine, particularly around the Jerusalem area, still had a great deal of freedom, in particular when it came to their society and their way of worship and their way of continuing their culture. Rome said, that's fine. You guys keep doing that. just as long as we don't have another Maccabees incident. That's the issue. We can't be playing that game. So, conquest is the means of pursuing peace, which should be our ultimate goal. And throughout all of this, our aim is to increase our morale while decreasing the opponent's. Acts of atrocity are not generally good for increasing morale. If we have succeeded in completely dehumanizing and demonizing our opponents, for instance, if we look at the invasion of Nanking, the Japanese soldiers were already well along into demonizing and subhumanizing the Chinese. And so that particular atrocity didn't necessarily hinder their war effort because they were dealing with people who were lesser humans than they were. But if people are coming from nations that are more multi-ethnic, multicultural, who have deeper traditions of liberty, this is going to demoralize our forces. Even though acts of atrocity might demoralize our opponents, we have to make sure that we're keeping an eye out for our own morale at the same time. So there's a give and take here. And it needs to be considered based on what our state is like, what kind of government we have, what sort of people we have, and the same for the opponent. Throughout the course of these invasions, while we're moving towards our end, which is the subjugation of the enemy state, there are defensive advantages that we have to overcome. In previous episodes, we have discussed at length Clausewitz's ideas on defense, and I think he's quite correct when he assumes that defense is the stronger of the two, particularly in this time frame. If we look at the Gulf War, defense was not the stronger because the Iraq army was, I think, the third largest in the world at the time. They were not pushovers. However, that strength defensively didn't do much against basically the blitzkrieg tactics of the U.S. Army and the overwhelming bombing campaign of the United States Air Force. So in that particular instance, and in many others in the more modern period, this isn't necessarily true. But in the time of Clausewitz and in those preceding, absolutely, these defensive advantages would be in place. So, which ones do we need to overcome, and how might we do this? The first one is the use of ground. This always goes to the defender. They're always the ones who are going to be reinforcing before we get there. They're the ones who are going to know the territory the best. They're the ones that are going to know how to move through it, how to resupply through it. So the use of that ground is always going to go to the defender. Now, this is something that can be overcome. We can overcome it through scouts and guides to minimize the amount of strangeness that we have moving through it. We can always try to provoke the defender to move from their defenses. This is something that we talked about in the last episode when we were speaking about diversions and the idea of using these diversions to pull the defender away from whatever they are trying to defend, whatever prepared positions they might have, in order to put them more on our footing and to take away this particular advantage. I'm sure there are other ways that you may be thinking of yourself, so if you want to drop them in the comments, I would love to read them. The second one is the possession of a prepared theater. This goes to the defender always. However, this will typically vanish during the campaign. A prepared theater is a little bit different than just like the ground itself, because the ground itself is something that is localized, something where we're talking about an individual battle. But when we're talking about the entire theater, we're talking about lines of logistics, lines of communication, relationship to allies in terms of borders. As we advance further into the territory, as we take more and more, that is going to take away a lot of this particular advantage that the defense might have. So at the beginning of the campaign, they might be quite strong in this particular area, but as we're moving through and disrupting all of these lines that we've talked about, that is going to take away this particular advantage that the defender has. The support of the people would be the third point. Oftentimes when a war breaks out, they've got the support of the people on their side. It's a grand patriotic endeavor to be defending the state, and they're able to move forward and have that gumption on their side. However, unless we're dealing with a very warlike people who are galvanized by us pushing forward into their country, in many cases, this is going to make the people start to sway as their homes come under attack, as their sons are going off to die. This is going to start to become negative. So the support of the people is, again, in the defender's advantage in the beginning, but as we're going through the stages of our campaign, the support of the people might turn and actually become a liability for our opponent. You can't really do much if the people are rebelling against you. It's not a great look. So this is something that, again, must be overcome as a defensive advantage, but won't necessarily be there like the use of ground will. There's nothing we can do to take away the defensive advantage of the use of ground. That's just going to be a solid thing that we're going to have to deal with throughout the campaign. But in terms of the possession of the prepared theater and the support of the people, this is something that can start to cede to us. And the last one is the state of expectancy. Now, we talked about that a while ago. So if you want to go back and listen to the episodes where we spoke more at length on that topic, I would definitely recommend you do so. But to put it very succinctly at the moment, the state of expectancy is the idea of us being motivated, of us being ready, of being prepared, of being organized. This will become reduced for the defender as we go through our campaign. It might become reduced for any number of reasons. It might become reduced because of the internal organization disruption that we had talked about. It might become reduced because the people are no longer on the side of it, that their communications or their logistics are disrupted. There's a lot of things that can take away from the state of expectancy. So as that becomes reduced for our defender, again, talking proportions, that can only be our advantage. So thinking back to the episodes that we have talked about defense during, we're not always going to be on the attack when we're going through one of these campaigns. To do so is extremely reckless and risks the retaliation of our enemy. So we're going to make sure that we are thinking about this, that we are going to move up to a certain point, reinforce, re-equip, and then come up with a plan moving forward. So we're not always going to be attacking during a time of invasion. Likewise, the opponent may not always be defending. They're going to be doing sorties of their own. They might be doing counterattacks of their own. So understanding that there will be a play between these two states on both sides is extremely important. So, last, before we end the episode for today, the big thing to know, and the hardest thing to know, especially if we've got it going well, we're winning battles, we're taking territory, we've got our opponent on the run, we're getting resources. Knowing when to cease our invasion is extremely important, because the invasion can't go on forever. It can't be something that we're pushing for the entire time, because this will destabilize the war effort as a whole. So knowing when to cease that invasion, even if it feels good, even if we're on a roll, that can be what's called the gambler's dilemma. I've already invested this much, I might as well invest some more. No. Do not do this thing. Make sure that we're practicing that headspace that we've talked about before that comes with good leadership. We're not getting pulled one way or another in terms of our emotions. And that also means not becoming overexcited in our efforts. Because overextending means that we not only risk all of the gains that we have had during the course of this invasion, we risk far more. We risk the destruction of our war effort. We risk the opponent being able to turn this on us and perhaps doing an invasion of their own. So, to reiterate, there are several causes of strength as we're advancing as an army. Enemy army losses, the loss of inert means, their loss of territory, their loss, our gain, of resources, the loss of internal organization and regular action, their allies quitting their side and becoming our own, and the discouragement of the enemy. The causes of our strength decrease that we need to keep in mind are being compelled into a siege, the occupational forces that we need to leave behind, the extended line of communication, which is to say the extended line of logistics, the acquisition of allies by the enemy, and the great efforts of our adversary, or of relaxation by our own state. And when we are doing well, when we are getting what we want in terms of the means pursuing our end, we must make sure that we remember that conquest is not enough without proper follow-up actions, and not to overextend. I cannot repeat this enough. I want to repeat it as much as I've said the words local numeric superiority. You got to do this. You got to make sure that we don't overextend. It's almost as important as, say it with me, local numeric superiority. Well, this has been great, guys. I appreciate you tuning in, and I look forward to making the next one for you. And with that, we're going to be starting Clausewitz's ideas of planning warfare.